Hi Booktube and welcome to a new video. This is a recent reads. NDiaye, Vengeance is Mine, translated by Jordan Stamp. Astraea by Australian author Kate Kriumink. Apologies if I butchered that name, almost certainly have. Ali Smith's new book, Gliff. Gary Amdahl, American author, I Am Death, which is 2 novellas. Some poetry by Nam Le, 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem. And finally some non-fiction, my first completed book for non-fiction November. This is M.John Harrison, Wish I Was Here, an anti-memoir. This actually fulfilled 2 of the, I'm only counting it as one, but it could have covered 2 of the non-fiction November prompts. One was code and the other was path, and I'll explain why when I talk about this book. So I don't know if you recall, but in around 2016, 18, something like that, a book called Lullaby by French author Leila Slimani, I think it's her debut, or at least her debut in English, was really popular and got on prize lists and stuff. And I read it and I thought, I didn't really think anything of it really. And then this came along 2021. This is Vengeance is Mine by Marie NDiaye, and it covers similar ground, but it's so far superior. Knocks the Slimani into a cocked hat. So Lullaby was about a nanny who murdered her young charges, and it's trying to dig deep into her psychology. Pretty unsatisfactorily as it goes, to my mind. This has a mother of 3 children killing her children, but that's not really the centre. The focus of the book is the lawyer who is supposed to defend her. And this lawyer, basically, she's broken away to set up her own firm. She's struggling a bit, and a man comes into her office, who's the husband of this woman, and begs with this lawyer to defend his wife. And the lawyer thinks that she recognises him from her childhood. And she's trying to determine whether he recognises her. And this sets off a whole trail of sort of stuff. And what I love about this book is normally the sort of the Freudian notions of we are prisoners of our childhood, of our upbringing, of sort of key primordial events and all that stuff. Normally I'd run a mile from, because I find them formulaic and trite and not very engaging. They're done so well here, because she never signposts them. That's the point. She doesn't draw the reader's attention to, oh, I mentioned this earlier. She sort of slips them in almost without you noticing. And then you do realise that there are echoes from the past revisited and has influence on the next generations. This is a book about parents and children. This is a book about class, interestingly. So to give you a couple of examples. So the book starts off with the lawyer and her cleaning lady, what we call a cleaning lady. I mean, she's really a sort of French maid, although she doesn't live in the woman's house. And this maid also happens to be her client, because she's undocumented, and the lawyer's trying to get her legal status in France. And even though obviously she's doing her these 2 big favours, one, she's paying her when she's working illegally, and secondly that she's going to try and get her legal. So she should be very grateful, this maid, but she isn't at all. She's very sort of standoffish and hostile, and yet she's so good at her job, and the food she makes this woman to come back to is just extraordinary. So there's this sort of constant tension between the lawyer wanting this maid to like her, if not actually love her, I don't mean sexually love, and knowing that she probably despises her, and yet this maid carrying out her duties to such a high standard. So that's the first sort of establishing sort of relationship in the book. And gradually you realise that part of the reason the lawyer wants to get on well with her maid is because her own mother was doing these sort of similar house cleaning duties, and one day she was covering for another maid who couldn't make it,
and took her her lawyer daughter, obviously she was 6 years old, she wasn't a lawyer yet, on this one-off assignment in this house. And the 14-year-old boy, I think she's a 10-year-old girl at that point, not 6. The 14-year-old boy invites the girl up to his bedroom, and the father of the lawyer sort of thinks something nasty has gone on. There's been some sort of assault or whatever. But she denies it. The little girl denies it and actually says, no, this was the making of me, because this boy, 4 years my senior, sort of was challenging me sort of intellectually, and I had to argue and justify and give my worldview at age 10. And that ever since then, she'd always wanted to be a lawyer. She wanted to interrogate and question and quiz. So she says, no, far from it. My father has it wrong. This is actually the making of me. This set me up for life, kind of thing. Through these, the dealings with her housemaid, the dealings with the husband who's had his children murdered by his wife, going to visit the wife in prison to, get her side of the story. As I say, you get this sort of clever sort of reveals that almost aren't reveals. So, for example, the lawyer is not married, has no children of her own. Her last serious love, when they split up, he got married, he had a child, a daughter, and then he divorced. And he splits time with the daughter, goes to the mother for 1 week and then comes to him another week. But he's a working man, so sometimes he drops his daughter off with the lawyer, and the lawyer will take them to her parents to look after, because obviously she's also got a job. And there's an issue that the lawyer eventually falls out with her parents, so that that line of transmission for the girl to go with the parents can no longer sustain. So she asks her maid, who has 2 of her own children, to take her. And what you don't realise is that this little girl is then taken along by the maid to her other cleaning jobs, which is an exact echo of what the lawyer had when she was a little girl, and set her up for life. So it's this brilliant sort of plate spinning and sort of ricocheting pinball of the past and the present and ghosts. I just thought it was brilliantly done. I thought it was wonderfully written. 5 stars. And on to Astraea by Kate Kriumink. Now, again, I don't really read much historical fiction. I studied history at university, and I absolutely wanted a break from ever having anything to do with history again. But this is a subject I've never read before, and I was really interested to read it. So, the Astraea is a prison colony, penal colony ship, transporting women from England to Australia, and most of those women have basically been criminalised by having children out of wedlock. 19th century. And the main character, whose eyes we see through, she still is expressing milk, even though she's been split from her child, who's presumably been left back in England, or given to someone in England. So she's one of the younger convicts and inmates. And it's just a brilliant study of sort of life on board under decks. And I suppose in a way it probably has some resonances with the slave ships. That they are still already prisoners, but even things like eating and cleaning and is just so much harder in a ship than obviously if you're in a prison in land, and that's hard enough. And it's just about the relationship of the women to their male guards and the male pastor and the male doctor, the relationship of women with their children who are on board with them, other than, as I say, the main character. And it's just really, really well done. The detail's very good. And there's 1 or 2 just shocking moments. And they're shocking, violent moments, but not in the way you would have predicted. They're not sort of male on female violence at all. And I just thought it was beautifully done. 4 stars. And on to Ali Smith's Gliff. Now, I'm quite a big Ali Smith fan. But her summer quartet, her seasonal quartet, I thought was superb. And interestingly, what the stricture she set herself for those 4 books is that she would use real life political events at the time she was writing and insert them into the book, into each of the four quartet books that she was writing, which brings up an interesting question. It's very hard to do politics, real politics, well in novels. Either you're too sort of preachy and info dumping, or you're very oblique, and it's almost like, well, it's like a sort of a bolt on, or it doesn't really, it's very much a sort of bit of sort of adornment to the plot. And what was so good about Smith's quartet is because she was taking, she was writing in the real moment of the politics. She perfectly spanned those two extremes which normally let down political fiction. Here, the politics is, because she's chosen a sort of a dystopia, the politics is of things like technology and increasing atomization of people. There's a lot of class distinction here. So it's a very familiar politics. It's potentially a politics just over the horizon from where we are currently. But I have to say, I did feel it was a bit of a bolt-on, because the weird thing is, for a dystopia, it's almost pastoral, which is a very odd sort of status to be. Before I go into sort of what it's about, there are two siblings, a non-defined older sibling and a younger sister. And the best thing about the book is, in typical Ali Smith fashion, is the discussions they have around words. I mean, they have a very sort of Socratic dialogue between them anyway, of sort of, asking a question or putting through a point of view and then it being criticised and sort of dissected and stuff. And one of the words is Gliff, spelt like that, which is a real word. I didn't know, I only know the other spelling, which is going to be the title of the book next year that sort of interweaves into this one, called Gliff. And Gliff is a word that has so many meanings, and Smith gives us all the meanings, that it actually collapses under its own weight, because it's one of those words that has so many meanings, not even shades of meanings, but things that contradict others of its meanings, that it becomes meaningless. But one of the meanings it doesn't have is as a proper noun, as a name. And the younger sister, basically they get hold of a horse, more of which anon, and she calls it Gliff, so that she sort of rescued the word from meaningless by conveying it onto this horse, by calling them. She's the only one who can sort of really sort of tame this horse. And the horse is really, really important, which is why I say this is a pastoral dystopia. So the actual plot is, these two siblings are being driven by their stepfather to safety because there are what are called unverifiables, people who are either sort of political opponents and dissenters, or they don't have the right paperwork, and they sort of become persona non grata, and if they're caught, they'll be put into re-education camps. And there's this rather sort of Heath Robinson contraption that sort of sprays red paint on the ground, marks areas with red paint, and their house is marked, that someone in that house is unverifiable. That's why they have to vacate the house, and the stepfather quickly drives them to safety, and he provides 10 days of provisions for them, says he'll be back, he's going to get their mother, and then he'll come back for them. So they're in this sort of old sort of workers' cottage in a rural area. And they sort of meet other people, some are dissenters, some aren't. It's a fairly sort of fluid cast of characters. And that's basically it. That's the plot. And as I say, most of the description is of their time, first of all in this sort of rundown cottage, capturing the horse. When their cottage, they sort of abandon it and go to a community of dissenters. And not much happens, really. It's I didn't get much out of this book, other than, as I say, the language exchanges between the two sisters, which I thought was fabulous. But the rest of it, I didn't really buy, because, as I say, it was a dystopia, and you could clearly see the roots of it. So, for example, the well-off characters, who tended to be members of the upper classes, they had devices which are an amalgam of smartwatches and an iPhone. in which everything about them, their health, their documentation, they could look up anything on the net that was still allowed. But people like the siblings who don't have them, they don't go. There's no schools. All the education that are given to children and teenagers is through these devices on their wrists. And because these siblings and others in the book don't have these devices, they're not given any education. And it was only their mother, as a sort of dissenter, someone who could read the runes as to what's happening with technology's sort of remorseless drive. She taught them to read. She taught them to sort of have inquiring, curious minds. So, as I say, it's a recognisable dystopia. But a lot of the book is a sort of an idyll within the limitations in this countryside. Yeah, it didn't quite hang together to me, but let's see what its answering book Gliff brings next year. So I gave it sort of 3.5, 4 stars. And on to Gary Amdahl's I Am Death. And these are 2 novellas about death through capitalism, really. The first one I just thought was stupendous, a really fantastic story about a gangster and his ghostwriter, or really a ghost editor. And this down on his heel journalist has sort of ended up writing for a local paper. And one of the articles he does is he sort of takes a tour around a morgue and interviews the people there. And one of the young guys there, called Enrique, I think, talks about how, you know, he sees it as his job to give these dead people dignity. It's almost as if he doesn't want to resurrect them and bring them back to life, but he wants to treat them as if they're still living, make sure they get a proper sort of send-off. And the gangster, or the gangster's consigliere, lawyer, they see this article and they really like it, so they approach this journalist and sort of say, look, we've got a project for you. And it's very mysterious because they sort of make contact when they want, and there's great periods of silence. They never really reveal what this is all about, until eventually they deliver the self-penned memoir from the gangster. And they ask this journalist, I say they, the gangster never speaks throughout the story. He's ageing, and you know, he's sort of coming to the end of his career, if not his life. And the consigliere says, look, would you read through this? Let us know what you think. And then that moves into, we want you to edit it. And the journalist thinks, wait a minute, this guy's an infamous gangster in this area. I could get a sub-story. I could do sort of investigative journalism and dig down. So when he's allowed admission to this gangster to sort of hang out with them, he's making mental notes on the sort of the counter story that he himself might write. And it's why it's so good is the tension is incredible. You've got a gangster who never speaks. You've got his garrulous lawyer who never stops speaking. You've got the journalist who's trying to play 2 sides with this guy. You've got the threat of violence throughout, and I won't spoil the ending. You've also got the counterpoint of Enrique, because the gangsters are guys who basically end people's lives, whereas Enrique is dealing with dead people and trying to sort of, not, as I say, not give them life, but treat them as if they're still alive, whereas the gangsters come across live people but render them dead in the course of their gangsterism. I just thought it was a really well put together, clever, unusual. You know, I've read loads of gangster stories. I've written a ghost-written gangster novel of my own, which I'm looking to find a house for, publishing house for. And I just thought this was really unique and really well done. The second story I was slightly less taken with, because it's set in the corporate world, the sort of self-consuming office culture of all these characters with their sort of traits and tics, all vying for sort of security of position and promotion, which we have seen done before. And although, again, it's very well written, and I thought the characters were very well delineated one from another, it's, you know, office culture is something I look to get away from because I have to do it in my day job. I don't really want to read about it. So I was slightly less engaged with that. But I will say, this was published in 2008, and the last 3 elections in America have not recognised what Gary Amdahl writes here.
He felt, this is at an office party, he felt foolish, embarrassed and drank sweet rum drinks as far as he could disguise his discomfiture. His growing shame that his life, had come to this, and he had allowed himself to be present at such a gathering. Luckily, everyone seemed to feel the same way, ashamed at the lengths to which they had gone to be amused, and had adopted the same method of coping, fraternity house levels of intoxication. But this kind of mass self-deceit seemed only to be undoing their ability to remain amused. There was a dangerous current of hostility running through every exchange of favourite song lyrics or bottle of Buffett beer. In this way, it was no different than a stock car race or a football game or election or war. One was there to support the team, and the team in turn assuaged the superficial loneliness and underlying, almost infrastructural fear of metastasising anomie that was the cross every white wealthy Christian had to bear, and that sometimes was used in place of a spine. Everywhere that people were encouraged to support a team, overconsumption of alcohol was frankly encouraged as well, along with the primitive but inarguably effective means of frightening enemies, the painting of one's face. The bonus here was that the men could wear coconut bras and grass skirts, and women nothing but lees and bikini bottoms. I just think that sums up American politics and possibly British politics to some extent. It's like you want to be on the winning team. Doesn't really matter what the politics are. Not only do you want to be on the winning team, you want to make your contribution by shouting the loudest, by waving the colours, by decrying and singing the songs to put down the other lot, the other party. Unfortunately, politics in Britain and America have become like supporting team sports. Anyway, I thought this was really, really good. 4 stars. And on to Nam Le, some poetry. So it's called 36 Ways of Writing a Vietnamese Poem. And it is a book, a furious book, about the Vietnamese-American experience, the difficulty of language, of culture, of being identified as you know, Asian, even when you're American, and when you're American, you want to, you know, preserve your Vietnamese heritage, and just sort of how difficult it you know, all of these struggles and these microaggressions upon you are. It reminded me of the novel Interior Chinatown, but this is poetry, so it's much more finely honed. And I'm just going to read a poem as an example. This is 5 stars, this book. This is poem number 15 called Diacritical, which I have to say is a pun I've used myself, I think. Oh no, I did Diatribe. He's done Diacritical. All in the tone. Give us each day our diacritics, our low and high, fall and rise, our horns and holds. Flat we are without. You like that, no doubt. Give us our, and then there's 6 Vietnamese words which I'm not going to try and pronounce. For ours is not your flat euphony, your squeezed friction speech, but full mouth music. Tripping of water over stone-carved lingers. A rising tang of early season mango in the mouth. Trill of moonlight and wind on silk curtains. Or reflected sunlight prismatic on rice paddies along the Baie d'Along. Coloratura descant of US bombs, scintillae of mother's ivory comb as it falls in the ivory mirror as if through water. I just, you know, so many of these poems are so good. 5 stars. And finally, M.John Harrison's anti-memoir, not a memoir, an anti-memoir. And I said that this fulfilled either of the 2 of the prompts for the non-fiction November, either code or path. Path because all memoirs to some extent are paths, and nature and describing natural scenes and objects forms a chunk of this. Code because most of this book is wrestling with the nature of a writer to fiction, the nature of memory, the nature of metaphor, the nature of fantasy and sci-fi. And the more you push away from reality, which is what M.John Harrison does, the less value of a memoir that is supposedly rooted in rooted in reality. That's M.John Harrison's point, I think. He himself walked out of his life several times, had sort of complete sort of do-overs of doing things differently.
which almost sort of erased the memory of what he'd been before, again making the piecing together of a memoir very difficult. He doesn't really try. There's not much personal life history in here. There's a lot about the journey to being a writer, and then the journey to honing down his craft, to choosing the genres that he chooses. But there's not much personal stuff. The main personal stuff, it's a book in 4 parts, and in part 3 he moves to Barnes in southwest London, and a lot of it is about the garden there and his cat who is ageing towards death. That's about as personal as it gets, other than the stuff about writing, which is very personal, his personal journey, as I say, to being an author. And he's really good about thinking about these things. So this is on metaphor. So he's forever battling between describing things as they are, describing objects, describing scenes, and using metaphor to do that, which we all do. But that, as I say, takes it further away from reality. I continue to be an observer who's never much good at observation, stuck with a means of communication which can't carry enough information. Hence the constant retreat to metaphor. The attempt to push through into something else is always a failed attempt to be in the real. Metaphor is giving up too soon. There is also the question of what the superposition at the heart of any metaphor actually offers the reader. Push an analogy hard enough and it will break down. But metaphors just continue to point at something which never really claimed to be there or be definable in the first place. I love metaphor, and I wouldn't be without it. It's only that every so often a 15-year-old self of mine sits in a room in Warwickshire in 1960 and regrets it cannot use words to photograph and pass on to the reader the exact way the smoke rises from a cigarette. And that is his constant battle, as I say, between description of the reality around him versus the use of metaphor to try and encapsulate it. But that automatically is an artifice and makes it artful and takes it away from reality. I have to say, I'd heard a lot of good things about this, and I was interested in the idea of an anti-memoir. And it isn't an anti-memoir. It's a memoir that refuses to deal in the personal other than very specific sort of boxes, such as being a writer and things like that. I got a lot out of his reflections on being a writer because I'm a writer myself. But as a whole, the book didn't quite deliver what I'd sort of hoped and anticipated. But I still give it 4 stars because there's a lot of really good insight into writing. And that's it for this week. Till next time, thanks very much.